In 334 BC, Alexander the Great launched one of the most impressive campaigns in human history, when he conducted an invasion of the greatest empire ever built, and without much difficulty swept it off the map, obliterating them in every battle they fought, granting him an empire that stretched from India to Greece. In 1206, Genghis Khan founded the Mongol Empire, which would go on to sweep into China, Persia, Anatolia, and Europe, squishing beneath it the greatest civilizations in the world and creating the largest contiguous empire in human history. This is how territorial conquest normally works in history. An army invades a country and conquers it, but the Habsburgs had different ideas of how things should work. This family had a knack for politically manoeuvring their way into acquiring territory relatively bloodlessly. Carinthia, Carniola, Tyrol, Burgundy, Bohemia, Spain, all of Spain's territories, and the Holy Roman Empire were all territories acquired by the Habsburgs without almost any fighting, instead acquired with things like marriage alliances and inheritance treaties. I'm not saying that the Habsburgs were all too peaceful. They, like any other great power, have fought countless wars to maintain their position, but I still contend, because of all the examples I showed you, that most of the Habsburgs' territorial expansion was done peacefully. So, let's dive into the history of the Habsburg family and learn how they conquered Europe through marriage. But first, just a quick guide to the citations of this video. Every time I want to cite a source, I will put the citation in the top right hand corner of the screen. The citation will include the name of the person who wrote the source, plus either the date the source was published, or the page of the source that I am citing. So let's say I want to cite a source by a man named Patrick, and I'm citing specifically page 69 of that source, and the source was published in 2025. In the top right hand corner of the screen, I will put either Patrick page 69 or Patrick 2025. Then you can scroll down to the sources list that I placed into the description of this video and Control F, Patrick, so you can then find and read the source that I cited. If you understand that, thank you. Let's get into the video now. But before we learn about the Habsburgs, we have to learn about the history of Austria, and that's because the history of Austria is inseparably tied with the history of the Habsburgs. When the Habsburgs centralised all of their land in the 19th century, they centralised it under the Austrian Empire. When talking about history, it's actually quite common to use the words Austria and Habsburg interchangeably. So, let's learn about the history of Austria. The history of Austria began in 976 AD, when Bavaria created the March of Austria. Although in this case, a march is not a special kind of walking that soldiers do. A march is the name of a type of territorial subdivision that existed in Germany in the Middle Ages. It was just a border region. And so Austria started off in the 10th century as a march of Bavaria. But anyway, the Margravate of Austria was not shy about participating in international politics. In the 11th century, the Pope and the Emperor were competing for who could control all the churches in Germany. And at first, Austria, led by Leopold II, supported the Emperor, but then he switched sides to support the Pope. And the Emperor wasn't happy about this, so he sent Duke Vratislav to obliterate the Austrians in battle, and he succeeded. Then Leopold II died, and Leopold III really was not happy about the fact that his father had been obliterated in battle by an ally of the Emperor. So he decided he was going to stay neutral in the current war between the Emperor and the Pope. But then all the princes in Germany realised that they all wanted peace with the Pope. And the only thing keeping them from peace was Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor. And so they all decided they didn't want Henry to be the emperor anymore. And so Leopold seized his chance. When Henry V led a rebellion against his father, Henry IV, Leopold supported that rebellion, and as a reward, he was granted the hand of the new emperor's sister. The ruler of the Babenbergs was even nominated as Holy Roman Emperor, although he turned down the role because he wanted to focus on taking care of his own land. Taking the side of Henry V was not the only time that the Babenbergs were able to gain power and prestige by picking the right side in a war. For example, in the 12th century, the Hohenstaufens were fighting the Welf family, and the Austrians sided with the Hohenstaufens, and that resulted in the Babenberg family, which ran Austria, being made ruler of not just Austria, but now all of Bavaria in 1139. All of this changed when Emperor Frederick I came to power. Frederick wanted peace between the Hohenstaufens and the Welfs, so he made the Margravate of Austria into the Duchy of Austria and gave it independence from Bavaria. He then deposed the Babenbergs from their rulership of Bavaria and confined them to Austria again. So now I'm going to move on and mention one of the more important acquisitions of land in Austrian history, the acquisition of Styria. You see, basically, the ruler of Styria realized that he was not going to be able to make any male heirs, so instead, he signed a treaty with the Babenbergs, stating that when he died, the Babenbergs would become the dukes of not just Austria, but Styria as well. And in 1192, the Babenbergs gained Styria. 1192 was actually a busy year for the Babenbergs. That was the year they got excommunicated from the church, because they kidnapped the King of England and ransomed him back to England for a very high price. So now, England can claim to have funded a bunch of very expensive urban development and infrastructure projects in Austria. So you know that the Habsburgs do take charge of Austria eventually. But how? Well, in 1246 AD, the male line of the Babenbergs died out. Now on paper, this shouldn't have been a problem because it was technically possible for a woman to succeed to the throne of Austria. However, it was unclear how that might happen, and realistically, that wasn't gonna happen. And so instead, they invited the ruler of Bohemia over, Ottokar, to come and rule Austria and Styria instead. Hungary invaded and pinched Styria, but Ottokar managed to take it back. And so now, Ottokar had everything he needed. He had Bohemia, he had Austria, Styria, and all the associated Babenberg territories that they'd conquered that I haven't mentioned because this video would take too long. He had it all. Until the Habsburgs came along. You see, recently, Rudolf, the Red-Nosed Habsburg, had been elected to the position of Holy Roman Emperor, and he decided that he wanted Austria and Styria for himself. So, in 1276, he forced Ottokar, at gunpoint, to give all of the land he'd gotten from the Babenbergs to him. 2 years later, in 1278, Ottokar tried to retake all that land. He lost and died in battle. So now, the Habsburgs were in charge of Austria, Styria, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs originated in modern-day Switzerland, and they were named after a fort literally called the Hapsburg, Hawk's Fort. However, they soon expanded northwards and gained a power base in Swabia, Germany. But the reason that Rudolf, leader of the Habsburgs, was elected as Holy Roman Emperor was because he was seen as weak and malleable. He didn't have a lot of power. And for a lot of his reign, that was the case. But then, he conquered the former lands of the Babenbergs, giving him a power base in not only Swabia, but Austria as well. This made the Habsburgs so much more powerful, and now they were a credible threat to the German princes. The leader of the Habsburgs decided that he was going to start subjugating the German princes and bringing people under his control. The exact thing they'd elected him not to do. His plans were stopped in their tracks when he was murdered in 1308. The German princes, understandably afraid that if they elected another Habsburg, he would be just as power-hungry and despotic as his father had been, they instead elected a Luxembourg to run the country. But then in 1313, the Luxembourg guy died, and he was replaced by two people. The Bavarian leader and the Habsburg leader both had a lot of support at the time. Eventually, they had to cut a deal to co-emperor the country. But don't be fooled. Louis was the only one with any effective power. So eventually the Habsburgs agreed to step down in exchange for a bunch of local territories, which they got. Meanwhile, the Swiss began encroaching on Habsburg territory and pushing them out of the territory that makes up modern-day Switzerland. And in 1415, they eventually ejected the Habsburgs from the Habsburg. But by the 1350s, a Luxembourg guy was firmly back on the German throne. And this guy passed a bunch of laws that diminished Austria's role in the Holy Roman Empire. And Austria wasn't gonna have that. So, the Habsburgs came up with a response. So the Habsburgs magically happened to discover a bunch of documents from hundreds of years ago in which Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had given Austria, and now by extension the Habsburgs, a bunch more power within the Holy Roman Emperor. For example, the Duke of Austria was now going to become the Archduke. Wow, the Habsburgs said. It was so lucky that they had discovered these documents when they did, or else they might never have found out that they actually had so much more power than they actually thought they did. If it isn't obvious to everybody watching this video, the Habsburgs forged the documents. These documents were just like an act of fraud or something to make everybody think that the Habsburgs had more power than they did. In the end, Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, accepted some of the terms of the documents that the Austrians had found, but not all of the terms. And after that, the Habsburgs realised that if they cozied up to the Luxembourg family, you know, the people in charge, they might get a bunch of rewards. So the Habsburgs tried to be more cooperative with the Luxembourgs. The plan worked, and in 1363 the Habsburgs got Tyrol. In the 1360s, Rudolf, leader of the Habsburgs, died, and his family split their lands between them. The three corners of the Habsburg realm would spend the next few decades swapping territory with each other, and they all went off and had their own little adventures. For example, Frederick IV of the Tyrol did the anti-pope a favour. The Holy Roman Emperor was furious that somebody had helped the Pope, and so he put Frederick in jail. Now that Frederick was away from his land, his enemies, such as the Swiss, began to encroach upon his territory. For example, the Swiss took the opportunity to, in 1415, eject him from the Habsburg. Luckily, in 1416, the next year, Frederick escaped jail, returned to his Habsburg lands, and restored his control over Tyrol. In another part of Austria, there was a civil war, putting a man named Albrecht V in charge. Albrecht V was very smart. He began to cozy up to the Luxembourgs and be their best buddies as much as he possibly could. You see, at the time, there were three main families who all vied for power within the Holy Roman Empire. You had the Hapsburgs, they controlled Tyrol, Austria, Styria, all those places. Then you had the Wittelsbachs, who controlled Bavaria, and finally you had the Luxembourgs, who controlled, well, a lot of places, but most importantly Hungary and Bohemia. And the leader of the Luxembourgs, Sigismund, was king of not just those two places, but he was also the Holy Roman Emperor. And, as luck would have it for the Habsburgs, Albrecht V managed to become such good friends with Sigismund that when Sigismund died, Albrecht managed to inherit Bohemia, inherit Hungary, and even got himself elected the Holy Roman Emperor. Overnight, Albrecht had become one of the most powerful men on Earth. However, he wouldn't get to enjoy that power for very long because 2 years after he inherited all that land from Sigismund, he died of dysentery, no less. And a couple of months later, his wife gave birth to his child. And that child was ironically called Ladislav the Posthumous. So anyway, even though Ladislav had only just been born, he was technically the king of Bohemia and Hungary. Obviously they weren't going to elect a baby as Holy Roman Emperor, so they elected that guy Frederick. Frederick V actually took on Ladislav as his ward. And the fact that the king of those places was under his care, that gave him a lot of influence over Bohemia and Hungary, and that is where he derived most of his power. According to Habsburg tradition, you were supposed to release somebody from your wardship when they reached the age of 12. But when Ladislav reached the age of 12, Frederick refused to release him from his wardship, and people were not happy about that. So, in 1452, 12 years after Frederick became the Holy Roman Emperor, he finally went to Rome to get himself properly coronated. Normally the emperor would pay for his own coronation, but in this case, Frederick couldn't afford it, so the Pope paid. After being coronated by the Pope, Frederick returned to find that his lands were in rebellion against him, demanding that he release Ladislav from his custody. Not only that, but leaders in Bohemia and Hungary were on the side of the rebellion. Having no other choice, Frederick released Ladislav from his custody. And so a regent was installed in Bohemia and Hungary to rule on behalf of Ladislav, but both Ladislav and his regent died in the 1450s. And so Bohemia and Hungary transferred to rulers who were from Bohemia and Hungary, and neither of them were Hapsburg. And that wasn't the only time during Frederick's reign that Habsburg power significantly collapsed. One of his major successes was he managed to get his son Maximilian married into the line of Burgundy. This gave the Habsburgs more power due to their alliance with Burgundy, but it also put them at war with France. Meanwhile, Hungary invaded Austria and took Vienna, and the Habsburg ruler of the Tyrol planned to sell his country to the Bavarians. Meanwhile, Maximilian in Burgundy had been arrested by the rebellious citizens. All of these three things combined looked like a total Habsburg collapse was imminent. But never fear, Maximilian is here to save the day. Maximilian was released from custody. He promptly rushed east and got the Tyrol under his control before he moved north and drove the Hungarians out of Vienna. When Frederick finally died, he left his son in charge of the Austrian and Burgundian lines. And Maximilian Habsburg himself made a bunch more gains for the Habsburgs. For example, he got his son married into the Spanish royal family, and then after a bunch of Spanish royals suddenly died, Philip the Handsome, yes, that was his actual name, of Habsburg, suddenly became the King of Spain, along with his wife, Juana the Mad. So Maximilian died and was succeeded by his son, Charles V, who was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Under Charles V, the Habsburgs would go on to conquer the Netherlands and Milan, and most importantly, in 1526, the King of Bohemia and Hungary died, and this left both of his territories available for other people to come in and take them. The Habsburgs managed to get themselves elected as head of Bohemia, and they also managed to get themselves elected to the head of some of Hungary. I say some of Hungary because the election resulted in a civil war in which the opposition party managed to maintain control of some of Hungary, the Habsburgs got another chunk of Hungary, and the rest of it went to the Ottoman Empire, who supported the opposition. So now, the Habsburgs were arguably at the height of their power. They had territory in Italy, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia. They had Silesia, Flanders, the Netherlands. They even had Spain and the Western Mediterranean islands. But inevitably, all powers entered decline eventually. In the 16th century, Protestantism, especially Lutheranism, were on the rise. And it soon became clear that a vast majority of the population of the Habsburg lands were Protestant. Obviously, it's impossible to know the exact number because this was the 1550s, but one source I read estimated it at over 70%. And that's just the thing, it was in Austria. Many places in the Holy Roman Emperor were going Protestant, and the Habsburgs did not like that. So, in 1548, they tried to ban Protestantism within the empire, and people did not like that. Because remember, there were so many Protestants in the empire. They thought, well, there's more of us than there are of them, so why on earth should we take this lying down? So, in 1552, Saxony, supported by France, put together a coalition of countries ready to force Austria to allow Protestantism within the empire again. They stormed into the Tyrol, capturing Innsbruck and forcing the Emperor Charles V to flee from the city. And Charles wasn't going to take this attack lying down either, so he sent his armies to besiege Metz. The German countries had given 3 cities, including Metz, to France, in exchange for her support against Austria. And now, the Habsburgs were going to try and get Metz from France. They surrounded the French garrison of 6,000 soldiers with their much larger army of 20 to 60,000 men. They used all 150 of their cannon to do extreme damage to the city's defences, and it looked like they might be able to break into the city. But then, massive epidemics, including dysentery and typhus, flooded the Austrian army, forcing them to break off their attack. Defeated at Innsbruck and Metz, the Habsburgs realised they were going to have to legalise Protestantism within the empire. However, Charles V, who had already suffered a humiliating defeat at Metz, was not going to put his signature to such a humiliating document. So, over the course of a few years, he resigned all of his positions. In 1556, the last of his territory were handed over to his descendants. Then he retired to Spain, where he died 2 years later, in 1558. God damn it. With Charles finally gone, the Habsburgs signed a concession. From now on, each individual ruler within the Holy Roman Empire would be allowed to decide which religion his subjects would have to follow. Still, the Habsburg Empire was definitely an extremely dominant power in Europe, and it was doing extremely well for itself with all the territory it had. However, soon enough, it would suffer a massive defeat that would shift the balance of power in Europe from Austria to Sweden and France. And that war would be known as the 30 Years' War, and if you want to learn more about the 30 Years' War, you can click on this video, appearing on the end screen now.